Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and on behalf of myself and my co-host, Bob Catell, we're delighted to have you join us for today's webinar with Badar Khan and Heather Briccetti. First of all, thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us, and we certainly hope you've stayed well and are managing through this period. But we are delighted to have you join us today for what I think will be a fascinating conversation. Also want to thank our sponsors, Con Edison, US Grid, Schiff Hardin, Broadscale, Bracewell, National Grid, the Grace Richardson Fund, API, and our series underwriter BP for making this webinar series possible. One short point I'd love to lay out for you all, because we welcome questions from the audience for the latter part of the hour discussion. There's a questions tab along the right side of the dashboard on your screen. And if you type in your question, we're going to get to as many as we can before we wrap up promptly at 2 to make sure that everyone can get on to the rest of their day. So thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over now to my co-host, Bob Catell.
Thank you, Bill. And I'd like to also welcome all of you to today's seminar organized by Our Energy's Policy. I have the pleasure to be on the board of Our Energy Policy, and have really been impressed with the programs, Bill, that you've been putting on lately. As Bill indicated, I'm delighted to be a co-host for today's Energy Leader webinar to discuss navigating a path to net zero. As all of you know, many states, particularly New York, have very aggressive goals to reduce carbon fuels and achieve zero emissions. The challenge, of course, is how do we get there while maintaining a reliable energy delivery system and at a reasonable cost. We're very fortunate today to have a great panel to address the subject. From National Grid, a company that has made a real commitment to net zero, we have the president of National Grid US, Badar Khan. Badar is very focused on driving the company's future and exceeding customer expectations in making the energy delivery system of tomorrow possible. He leads National Grid's core regulated businesses, serving 20 million customers across Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island. He has extensive experience in spanning retail power, gas, and energy-related services, renewable energy, wholesale energy trading, power generation, and even goes back to oil and gas exploration. He's a very forward-thinking person, has a track record of delivering on technologies to transform the way homes and businesses use energy. I had the pleasure of first meeting Badar when he was president of National Grid Ventures, where he was responsible for growing a global portfolio of energy products. Badar, prior to that, worked for a company in the UK, Centrica, for 14 years, and also was the CEO of Direct Energy. So he has a wealth of experience in the energy business. He has an engineering degree from Brunel University in London and an MBA from the Wharton School. And I won't read all of the various organizations where he's served on a board and served in a leadership position. Holding the conversation with Badar, we're very fortunate to have Heather Briccetti, president of the Business Council of New York State, which is truly the leading business organization in the state, advocating for the business community. Heather joined the Business Council in 2007 as Vice President in Government Affairs, and I actually have memories of working with her in those days, overseeing their legislative programs. She has a Juris Doctor from the Albany Law School. Prior to the Business Council, she was a consultant and lobbyist for Powers and Company, where she advised them on a range of issues, including economic development, which included some projects like the Javits Center and Yankee Stadium. You may be familiar with those. She's had a very extensive career. She was assistant counsel to the New York State Senate Majority. She was also counsel to the New York State Assembly Majority and special counsel to the New York State Attorney General. Tremendous experience. Actually founded her own private law experience. Again, if I read all the boards and committees that she served on, we wouldn't have time for the discussion. It's extensive. She also serves on a leadership position at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and on the National Association of Manufacturing. So her experience and her extends well beyond New York. So without further ado, I will now turn the microphone over to Heather. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob. I really appreciate that, and I miss working with you. What is not as part of my bio is the fact that I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and Niagara Mohawk headquarters are in this really cool building, and Niagara Mohawk is now part of National Grid. And I grew up with this huge admiration for Niagara Mohawk, strictly because the building was really cool. But that was sort of the beginning of my relationship with energy and utilities, and it's lasted all the way through. So I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you, Badar, for doing this. Really appreciate it. Do you want to say anything before we get started?
Well, no, thank you, Heather, for hosting the conversation with me, and I'm delighted to be here and keen to get into it.
All right, so let's jump right in. So the first question I have for you is National Grid recently launched the Responsible Business Charter and your Net Zero by 2050 plan. Can you speak a little bit about those plans, what they are, how they were developed, how they work together?
Absolutely, sure. So I think, as you know, we operate in states that are committed to mitigating the impacts of climate change, and frankly are some of the most progressive in the country. And we believe that decarbonizing the energy system is one of the biggest challenges facing our world today. And we believe that National Grid has a huge role to play in that journey. Last year, we announced that we're committing to reduce our own emissions to net zero by 2050. And actually, we've already achieved a 75% reduction in emissions across our US business that spans a number of different areas. Last month, we launched what we called our Responsible Business Charter, which also included our Net Zero by 2050 plan. And in it, we say that as a company, we stand for more than just making money for shareholders. And as a company, we can and will have an impact on the environment, on the people that work for us, and in our communities. So alongside the net zero commitment, we've got commitments to workforce skills development, diversity in our workforce, and an equitable transition for our communities. Our net zero by 2050 plan sits within the Responsible Business Charter. And there we've actually also increased our ambition towards net zero. We've expanded it to include the emissions of not just our own direct operations, but also from the sale of electricity and gas to our end customers. And that's because the reality is our direct emissions, in other words, the activities that we control directly, are only about 2% of society-wide emissions. And so if we're going to make a meaningful difference, we need to not only reduce our own emissions from direct operations, but also enable the decarbonization of society more broadly. And so our net zero plan lays out what we're doing over the next decade, and they really broadly cover three or four areas. So the decarbonization of power, the decarbonization or elimination of emissions from transport, and the decarbonization or reduction of emissions from heat. So that's the big picture.
So it's interesting. I see in the business community a lot of folks broadening their charter, expanding their mission, and I spent a lot of time talking to businesses. I applaud you for doing that, but also I would ask you, if you were talking directly to the business community, could you elaborate for a minute, like what these plans mean for their bottom line? Will it be any impacts or transitional friction?
Sure, Heather. So if I just take a step back and just talk about what the impacts are across the three sectors, then we can talk about the impact for customers and for businesses. So the three sectors, as said before, around power, transport, and heat. And we're making some huge strides in each of the three areas. So if I just talk about decarbonizing generation, I actually think our industry's made huge progress already. Emissions actually in generation account for less than 20% of society-wide emissions today. And in terms of our own emissions, we're expecting to transform our own Long Island generation fleet over the coming decade. But beyond our own generation, we've been expanding our energy efficiency programs. We've invested $4 billion in energy efficiency and demand side response since 2012. That's helping customers use less energy. We've been integrating onshore, offshore renewables, as well as integrating distributed generation. We signed contracts to procure almost half of the supply of our customers in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We've connected some 90,000 distributed solar systems, so rooftop solar, about 900 battery systems. So there's quite a lot of activity there. The second area is decarbonizing transport. That accounts for over 40% of emissions today. And obviously, we'll need to see a huge ramp up of electric vehicles. And I'm actually very optimistic we'll see that just with the number of players we have there. Our role, of course, is primarily around enabling the charging infrastructure. And we've made huge strides in the last couple of years with electric vehicle charging infrastructure, as well as working with transit authorities, so in Albany and Buffalo, to put electric city buses on the road. The third area is decarbonizing heat. It gets pretty cold up here, and so heating is a big deal. It actually accounts for over 30% of emissions in the Northeast. Natural gas provides not just 60% of all heating, but it's also the most affordable by a long way. So this will be the hardest nut to crack. I think this will be the area that'll have the most impact on businesses, to your specific question there. For our part, what we're doing is eliminating the methane leaks that exist on the gas network. But in the longer term, we've been looking at everything from electrifying heat to renewable natural gas and hydrogen. And I think it's fair to say that this is the area where we're likely to see some of the more significant impacts for businesses. Clearly, on the energy efficiency side, we'll need customers, businesses to participate in energy efficiency programs that we put together to help customers lower their own consumption, to respond to actionable insights that we provide to customers. On the transport side, we'll enable the charging infrastructure, but we'll need customers to actually adopt electric vehicles. I think for heating, whether it's homes or businesses, we'll need customers to look at ways to heat their homes differently, whether it's air source heat pumps or geothermal loops, or even using hydrogen for some of their more complex industrial equipment.
Yeah, so you sort of got to my next question, which is, what is the customer's role in these plans? How do you get them engaged and I guess more than engaged, but invested in meeting these objectives?
Well, that's right. So there's customers' engagement needs to be in areas like energy efficiency, potentially changing out the way that they heat their homes or businesses, adopting electric vehicles. But there's a ton of stuff that we are doing that actually doesn't rely on customers changing the way that they consume their energy. So, for instance, where we're looking at eliminating SF6, that's sulfur hexafluoride. That's a specific that's used for insulating electric networks. We're looking at eliminating methane emissions from our gas network, procuring the energy through offshore or onshore contracts, integrating these large-scale renewables. These are all things that don't require customer engagement. But there are areas, as we've just said, around energy efficiency, adopting electric vehicles, changing the way that customers heat their homes and businesses, that does require customer engagement. Our role clearly is making it easy for customers to engage. But we're a regulated utility, and so we will play a role. But I actually also believe that we need customer-oriented technology or entrepreneurial companies to also scale up and be a big part of that solution around customer engagement.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot going on. What would you say is the biggest challenge that you face in meeting these goals?
Heather, I think I'll offer two perspectives. I'll give you a generic observation and a specific challenge. I think, more generically, our company is made up of engineers. Engineers solve problems, but they also look for proof and evidence and facts and figures to back up their plans. And so to believe that we might be able to achieve net zero requires us to believe in things that haven't actually happened yet, but instead believe that they could. I think the technology does exist. The issue that we have today is there are some, practical limitations and potentially affordability questions. And affordability is a hugely important issue for us, partly because we have to demonstrate to our regulators that everything we do is prudent and cost effective, but also because we don't get to choose our customers. We serve everyone. And therefore, the most vulnerable customers must be served and must not be left behind. But I think if you look back in history, in the early 1930s, I think less than 10% of rural America had access to electricity, and that had grown to 90% by the late 50s. And so in the space of almost 30 years, a tremendous transformation had occurred. And so the question that we've been asking ourselves is, do we believe that we can execute a transformation on the scale that, that has been achieved in the past? And our answer is yes, we believe it can be done. I think on the specific challenge, I think that is figuring out how to reduce emissions from heating. As I discussed before, that's both practical and affordable. And I think the good news is that there are plenty of people working on it, whether it's electrification pathways or renewable gas or hydrogen pathways.
Do you think the challenges are different regionally, or do you think they're sort of the same across the country? I mean, I know New York has I'll say unique regulatory environment, uniquely challenging maybe. But do you see differences in the challenge in meeting these objectives based on location?
I mean, I think there are clearly differences based on geography. Where up here in the Northeast, we have the coldest winters than any other part, as well as the Midwest in the country. And so how we solve for the future of heat that's practical and affordable, is a challenge that's specific to us. West Coast utility is clearly, experiencing the threat of wildfires. I think utilities in the South, will be dealing with hurricanes. So I think geographically, utilities are dealing with very different circumstances. But I would say I think there is a common sense of purpose that exists across all employees and all utilities, and that's about serving our customers and communities, and specifically addressing this decarbonization challenge that I think that we all agree with.
So you touched for a moment on the aspect of cost, and I could say, with confidence that when I talk to my business council members, their primary concerns are cost and reliability. How can utilities meet climate goals and at the same time ensure reliable, affordable service to their customers? And maybe this is an unanswerable question, but hopefully not.
I think that when you think about where we are today, we've signed up for a pretty bold ambition to reduce our own emissions to net zero by 2050, as well as the emissions from consumption of power and gas for our customers. And we can see that there are technologies that exist today, whether it's electrifying heat or using hydrogen or renewable natural gas for heat, or the adoption of electric vehicles, or taking energy efficiency to the next level. These are all things that we have sight of today. I think it's fair to say that we don't have all the answers for everything figured out over the next 30 years. So I just go back to, do we think that we can execute a transformation on the scale that our industry has in the past? And we believe that we can. But clearly, the goal is to do that in a way that's both practical, so hassle-free for our customers and businesses, as well as affordable. And that is the sort of challenge that we and all other utilities are working on.
Yeah, so 2020 has been a heck of a year. I don't think anyone at the beginning of the year, I think at the beginning of the year we were talking about wildfires in Australia, if I remember correctly, and certainly we've gotten off of that topic for the moment. But you know, all this uncertainty is a very hard thing for businesses, have to plan things like capital investments a long way out. And now we had an election. I don't know if you are aware of that. I'm sure you are. But it looks to me like there might be a shift in policy, especially towards clean energy. And can you talk for a minute about sort of what direction do you see new administration taking? I mean, you don't have to speak for them, but what do you anticipate? Is it going to change your plans moving forward, or does it reinforce that you are directionally doing the right thing?
Sure. I mean, I would say that our is more influenced by what happens at the state level. You know, with that said, you know, when you look at what a potential incoming Biden administration has talked about or put out around energy, you know, it's an infrastructure plan that's looking at over, you know, at $2 trillion over the next decade or more. But the goals are actually quite aligned with what we see from our state. For instance, Biden administration's talked about net zero by 2050, emissions power by 2035, energy efficiency priorities, you know, very, very similar to what we've been talking about. They've been more specific, talking about upgrading, you know, a certain number of buildings over a certain number of years to highest energy efficiency standards. But they talked about energy efficiency, transport. They talked about investment in clean technologies like battery storage, renewable hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration. So all of these areas are actually aligned to what what we've laid out for our net zero by 2050 plan. So decarbonizing power, transport, and so I think that a Biden administration would actually be more aligned to where we are in the states that we operate in, so Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island.
Is there anything you hope they stay away from or don't touch on in terms of national policy? Sort of a trick question, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that one area that I'm really pleased to see in some of the Biden administration's plans is ensuring that disadvantaged communities are not further disadvantaged. I think that in societal-wide transformation, sometimes it's the segment of society that actually that stands to benefit the most is sometimes left behind. And so I'm really pleased to see that. When I talk about our net zero commitments, I break it down into decarbonizing power, transport, and heat. The reality is there's a fourth area, which is how do we make sure that it's equitable and, again, not leaving anyone behind. That's an incredibly important goal for us as a regulated utility because we don't get to choose our customers. We serve everyone, and so one of our roles is making sure that everyone does benefit. So if I think about some of the efforts that we've been doing on energy efficiency, do our energy efficiency programs target low-income communities? Are there barriers that prevent people who rent, from exercising these energy efficiency incentives versus people that own? When we are rolling out electric vehicle programs, is it happening in areas that are lower income? So it's a question of systematically looking at our decarbonization agenda through a social justice lens to ensure disadvantaged communities are not further disadvantaged. And that's been a feature of the Biden administration's plans that I think are very aligned to how we think about this journey.
That would certainly require a fair amount of cooperation from the regulator also in terms of how you structure things to make sure that these communities aren't burdened by whatever increase in cost there might be relative to changing technologies, or making sure that you have deployment in a way that gives them access as well. Do you think that this is a national conversation, or is it a state level conversation, or maybe a little bit of both?
You know, certainly it's a conversation that needs to happen at the state level, but I think also needs to be supported at the federal level. You know, if I look back over the last 4 years, certainly the states that we do business in, Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, have progressed their commitment to decarbonization and to mitigating the impacts of climate change, significantly in the last 4 years. And the federal government's position hasn't probably been in the same place. And so I think that we can still make progress, as we've demonstrated in the last 4 years at the state level.
So you mentioned a whole bunch of things like carbon sequestration, decarbonization in general. There are some technologies that may not yet exist that we might need to reach full decarbonization. Do you think, you said engineers need to believe, right? do you believe that these technologies are going to come online in a time that will help you meet your time frame? And what is the role of innovation in all of this?
I think that innovation clearly has to play a bigger role across all parts, actually, of our agenda and our business if we're going to achieve these goals. I actually think that one of the biggest challenges goes beyond the innovation itself, and instead to how do we create a system that nurtures customer-focused innovation. So the challenge is on the system that nurtures innovation. In my experience, the most successful and sustainable innovation doesn't necessarily come from whoever spends the most. It actually comes from, I think, 3 things. Do companies deeply understand their customers? Collaboration, and then thirdly, testing your ideas early and frequently and with your customers, and be prepared to iterate and pivot. I think entrepreneurs, understand that, and I think the successful ones are really good at it. They tend to be laser focused in figuring out what problem they're solving for and how their solution is better than whatever else is out there. And they are increasingly working in a world of open source. Everything collaboration is just a normal way of working. And I think they've mastered concepts like a minimum viable product. When you're getting your minimally viable product, out to your customers quickly and continuously iterating. I think these things aren't always easy to do in large companies because of their size. Senior managers are sometimes spend their time internally versus externally. And I think for regulated utilities, because of the paradigm that we operate in, where we're often required to lay out for our regulators how we're going to spend the money we collect from our customers, sometimes for months or years in the future, that actually doesn't leave a lot of room for co-creation with customers or continuous iteration. And so I think that actually we need to spend time not just on the innovation itself, so the technologies, carbon capture, sequestration, green hydrogen, whatever it might be, but on the system or process by which we encourage and nurture innovation in the regulated utility space. I think that I don't believe any one of the players, so utilities, entrepreneurs, or regulators, will solve it on their own. I think we all have a role to play, and we'll need to bring insights from each of our perspectives and to solve this challenge by leading in together.
So yeah, I have to say, in talking to our members, I've seen some of the most creative and innovative approaches to things like efficiency come from large industrial users who, because of the high cost environment, just in general, the high cost of operating in New York, it forces you to look at new and different ways to save, to become more efficient. And sometimes you'll see really incredible innovations come from, in particular, some of the larger industrial users. You mentioned hydrogen, and I know the Federal Energy Department released an updated version of the hydrogen program plan. I did not read it, so don't quiz me on it. But I know that like the purpose is to drive down the cost of hydrogen so it can be used for fuel for vehicles, for power plants, appliances, and manufacturing. I know it's a part of your plan to decarbonize. Can you talk about the role hydrogen plays in your overall decarbonization strategy? What steps you're going to take to develop this? And when can I get a hydrogen car? You can end on that one.
I don't know about a hydrogen car, Heather, but I think that when we look at the decarbonization of heating question, hydrogen, I think, needs to play a role. You've talked about hydrogen beyond heating into industrial processes, but if I think about heating specifically, as I said before, it's a large share of emissions today, society-wide, and we think that there are multiple pathways to solve the question of how do we decarbonize heat. There are electrification pathways, so that's installing air source heat pumps on the side of buildings, ground source heat pumps underneath buildings. The issue with those are, air source heat pumps aren't always, they don't always work as effectively in very cold environments as we have up here. Ground source heat pumps aren't always easy to kind of work through in a dense urban environment just because the physical constraints. And so I think we have to be looking at alternative pathways, and that's why we've been leaning in on hydrogen. And that hydrogen as well as renewable natural gas and biogas, actually. On the hydrogen question specifically in New York, we're really excited to be participating in a hydrogen blending study, working with NYSERDA and Stony Brook University. And there we're looking at the ability of the existing gas network to integrate and store renewable hydrogen into our system. We've been including funding for different projects in our rate filings in both New York and Massachusetts to prove feasibility, but also to understand what it would take to scale them in the future. So, for instance, in Niagara Mohawk, we proposed a hydrogen demonstration project that'll be the first of its kind, as far as I know, in the U.S. It's a multi-use hydrogen facility in a partnership with Standard Hydrogen Corporation, located at an industrial site, looking at producing hydrogen from renewable electricity. If we're building all of this renewable large-scale generation, being able to use excess and therefore lower cost renewable energy to actually produce hydrogen, which is what we would call green hydrogen, and use it to sort of use it in the networks, to store it, blend it into the network. In Massachusetts, last week, we just filed a rate case for our gas business, which includes $50 million in funding for projects that span renewable natural gas, demand response, geothermal, as well as hydrogen. And again, it's looking at how do we, can we test the introduction of hydrogen for, a number of different customer systems, large customer systems, as well as blending hydrogen into the network for residential customers. I don't think that any of these initiatives are scalable today, but I think it's important that we work with customers, stakeholders, and regulators to try and develop frameworks for these solutions so that they can become scalable in the future.
So I have a really sort of wonky follow-up question. You said that hydrogen, existing gas infrastructure can be used for hydrogen, like the piping.
The pipe. The question, of course, is to what extent can you blend hydrogen alongside gas into your gas infrastructure? And I think that's the question that we want to explore and test with some of the pilots and projects that we're working on today.
Yeah. So I mean, this is sort of not off topic, but in New York, there's a desire to phase out natural gas as a fuel source for heating in a shorter time frame than the depreciable life of the pipes that are in the ground, which obviously creates this whole stranded cost situation that the consumers may end up bearing the cost of phasing it out before the value of the pipes have fully depreciated. And sorry, I'm not a tax lawyer or anything, but but it sounds to me like the hydrogen might offer a potential solution to those potential stranded costs, and it's just an observation. I'm interested in that. Maybe I should follow up with you at some point, or someone at Grid, and see if we can come up with something. So you're doing all this really great stuff. How are you letting your customers know? How are you getting the word out? And I mean, I think it's a really, many consumers would not think a utility company would be so, I guess, all in trying to address climate change and shift to a clean energy economy. So how are you sharing this?
Heather, we are we had an ESG day last month where we announced our responsible business charter, which again includes the commitments that we're making towards the impact that we can have on the environment, but also in terms of our own workforce and our communities. We've launched on that day our responsible business charter, as well as our net zero by 2050 plan. And so our perspective is we need to do more of that kind of dialogue. We're in conversations with customers in our local communities about some or many of these challenges. With respect to companies, and we've got an innovation arm, we call it National Grid Partners, which is investing in entrepreneurs that are working on the clean energy objectives. And so how can we invest in and encourage entrepreneurs to tackle some of these objectives? So I think if you think about what we're doing, we're trying to address the entrepreneurial space, our customers, small and large, working with regulators and stakeholders. I think it starts with being transparent about what our objectives are and what our goals are. Our net zero by 2050 plan is our attempt at being transparent about what our ambition is and what our commitments are, and making commitments that go back from 2050 to 2040 to 2030 to 2025, which is very similar to the kinds of commitments that our leaders in our states are making.
All right, well, that's good stuff. Still not going to tell me when I can get a hydrogen car, though, huh? I think we're supposed to have some time for questions, and I believe someone is supposed to be popping on here to tell us what questions have come in so far. So
yes, thank you, Heather. This is Kevin Marin with Our Energy Policy, and thank you to both our speakers. Great stuff so far. We do have a lot of questions coming in, so a quick reminder to our audience, if you do have any questions for Badar or Heather, please feel free to enter those on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll add it to our list. That being said, we'll get through as many as we can, but we do have quite a few on the list already. So starting off here, a few questions came in already about natural gas, so we kind of worked them together. A few people would like to hear about your views on the role of natural gas and how important it will be in terms of reaching net zero. And then also, what does this really mean for natural gas focused utilities?
Sure. I mean, I think that, as I said before, I think that decarbonizing heat is the kind of toughest nut, I think, that we need to crack, actually. And I think that the challenge is, how do we decarbonize heat in a way that's both practical, so meaning the least hassle for customers, as well as affordable. And I think that there are multiple pathways. As I said, both electrification pathways that don't require the natural gas infrastructure, so air source heat pumps, geothermal, ground source heat pumps, as well as pathways that will require an enduring gas infrastructure, and that's things like renewable natural gas and biogas, as well as hydrogen that we talked about earlier. We believe that simply because today it's not easy to see that the electrification pathways are both practical and affordable. And so I think it's important for us to be pursuing multiple pathways and likely ending up with a mosaic of solutions that are appropriate for different customer segments or different geographies. And certainly the pathways that that rely upon renewable natural gas or biogas, as well as pathways that rely on hydrogen, likely will result in an enduring gas infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is from John Ackerley, and you already partially addressed this, but as a follow-up to your answer on heating, how can utilities be more supportive to modifying these systems?
Yeah, so I mean, I just give you an example of some of the things that we've some pilots and projects that we've been working on with respect to decarbonizing heating. We have we've been progressing Newtown Creek wastewater treatment project, which is a public-private partnership to convert New York City's wastewater and food waste into a source of clean energy. That project will produce enough heat to heat 5,000 homes, reducing emissions actually by 90,000 metric tons. That's the equivalent of 19,000 cars from the road. So there are examples like that are pilots and projects that we are working on today to lower emissions in New York, and also in our filings that we sought funding for in Massachusetts as well as the projects that we just talked about with respect to hydrogen. I think these are all efforts that we're pursuing today to eliminate emissions from the gas network, but also that demonstrates the potential scalability of these solutions in as alternatives to electrifying heat, so as alternatives to air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps.
Sure, thank you. Next question here is from Robert Walton. Can you address the cost of decarbonization and what it will look like on customer bills?
Well, that's a big question. I think that I think over the last decade, we have clearly seen that the cost of renewable generation has fallen. So whether it's the cost of large scale onshore wind across the United States or large scale onshore solar across the United States, we've seen falling costs of technology. We've seen increased efficiency from that form of generation, all to the point where, in some geographies across the United States, renewable generation is equivalent to natural gas-fired generation. And I think that that's a direction of travel that's been going for a decade or more, and I think it's likely to continue. Same with the costs of battery technology. We've been seeing fall over the past decade or more, and we expect to see it to continue to fall. So I think that when we think about affordability, we do have a clear track record of getting to a place where aspects of the clean energy transition have become affordable. When we think about transport and the full cost of ownership of an electric vehicle compared to a gasoline-powered vehicle, again, we are seeing cost curves fall to the point where fully electric vehicles, the total cost of ownership is becoming comparable to gasoline-powered vehicles. And again, that's a trajectory that again we've been seeing for the last decade. So for two of the sectors that I talked about, decarbonizing power and decarbonizing transport, we've been seeing a journey that's resulting in one that's affordable for all segments of society. The one that I think we still have some way to go, as I've said, is how do we find a way to decarbonize heat that's both affordable and practical. The consequence of many of these pathways requires us to think about how we heat our homes and businesses differently, whether it's a hydrogen boiler as opposed to a natural gas-fired boiler, or, as I said before, these air source heat pumps on the side of buildings. So I think that there's still a journey to go on the question.
Well, thank you for that. Next question here is from Dr. Andrew Kadak. Many people claim climate change is an existential threat. Given this, especially in New England and in your service territories, why are nuclear plants being shut down? Indian Point is the latest example. How do we bring nuclear back as part of the climate solution?
Well, I'm not going to comment on any specific plants trajectory and decisions that other companies are making with respect to their generation mix. I think that we can all see that there is there's a trajectory of reducing emissions for generation that is relying upon wind and solar, large-scale wind and solar, as well as distributed generation. I think the question that we have for ourselves as a society and an industry is how do we do it in a way that ensures both affordability, to the last question, as well as reliability. And so I think that whether it's nuclear or baseload gas generation or the introduction of batteries, I think these are all alongside intermittent. The issue with wind and solar, of course, is the intermittent nature of their generation. So batteries alongside the intermittent generation are all going to be part of the solution for the near term and potentially also for the medium term. I think that for companies like ourselves, which is National Grid is primarily a transmission and distribution utility where we're moving power from generation to customers, we need to make sure that we're investing in transmission and distribution infrastructure that allows for different forms of generation, intermittent, as well as builds in resiliency for when storms come in and to ensure that they're reliable for customers when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So I think those are all the considerations that we need to go through as we think about this journey.
Excellent, thank you for that. Next question here from Jason Dietrich. He's interested in our speakers' views on how the New York renewable energy vision is changing business models and how far along are we to the future envisioned of utilities as distributed power platforms. How does that relate to your net zero plans?
I'd love to know if Heather, you have a point of view on that as well, based on your work with businesses.
Well, I do. I would say that when New York has undertaken two very large initiatives, the Renewable Energy Vision, but also the CLCPA, which is a very ambitious green energy, zero carbon vision for the state, that both of which, CLCPA in particular is in the process of going through the regulatory process right now, and businesses are frankly unsure of how it's all going to get worked out, because if you have an industry that is very energy intensive and you have much lower costs right across the state line, it causes a company to question whether or not it makes sense to invest in this state, not knowing what the cost structure is going to be in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. We're working very hard as an organization to ensure that things like energy intensive industries are considered in our transition, and that there's some accommodation built in so that we don't end up defeating the purpose of lowering emissions by having companies make the unfortunate choice to just move somewhere else that doesn't have as stringent standards. So it's a very complicated, long-winded answer, but really we're working on it. I think that's that's the best I can say. New York is a challenging policy environment, and companies in New York tend to be very sophisticated in understanding how to navigate the regulatory structure, but it changes all the time. So you got to be on your toes.
Well,
and I just add, Kevin, I just add to that. I think that in this sort of transition to a cleaner society, we're clearly talking about large scale onshore and offshore generation that New York and many other states have been pursuing, but also local generation. And that's, I think the really interesting thing there is that, we can generate power locally on your roof. If we have the adoption of electric vehicles that we're all hoping to see, we'll be able, society will be charging electric vehicles at different places on the network at different times of the day. If we have this technology that allows customers to, large customers and small customers, homeowners as well as large businesses, to throughout the day, lower their demand, so use less energy at different times throughout the day. We've got a grid that is rather than being managed from like a top-down, managing the grid from like a top-down approach. We're actually looking at, we'd be required to manage the grid sort of bottom up. And I think the really interesting thing there is, in terms of business models, is how do you capture the locational and time value of distributed generation? So generation that, or distributed energy efficiency. So generation, so power or demand or not using energy at different times of the day and at different points along an electricity grid has value for us, because we need to manage the grid, ensure there is reliable supply for all customers. And so there is a business model around capturing that value and providing it back to customers, and using that value to engage customers very differently than I think we engage customers today. And I think that's a really interesting sort of business model evolution that I think we're seeing entrepreneurial, technology-based companies look to explore across the United States. And that's the kind of innovation and entrepreneurial activity that I'd love to see us see more of. And we need to find a way to encourage and nurture that kind of innovation in our sector today.
Well, thank you both. Great answers to a complicated question. Next here is from David Nagel. I'm interested in the impact of this agenda on your firm's bottom line, let's say through 2030. Do you see the need for innovation in financing and regulations to help see you through the next 10 years?
Yes. So, if I think about this transition, we're fundamentally, as a company, we build and maintain infrastructure that delivers power and heat to millions of people, 20 million people in the Northeast. And so clearly the electrification of power, transport, and heat will actually require us to build more electric infrastructure, actually. And so in some ways, a lot of what we do is just sort of more of the same. In many ways, it's not. I've talked about managing the grid from the bottom up versus top down, investing in technology and innovation. And so in some ways, this transition is one that's very aligned to what we do as a company. And therefore one that's not misaligned with our bottom line, if that's where the question was. But we are also, as a company, looking at green bond financing programs. So seeking financing from investors who are specifically looking to invest in companies, not just in our space in energy and utilities, but across economic activity, who are looking to make a difference on mitigating the impacts of climate change. And so we're attracting investors through our green bond programs that we've been pursuing over the course of the last year. With respect to the regulatory side, again, I think that there needs to be regulatory dialogue that continues to fund some of these pilots and projects that I spoke about across our decarbonization agenda, as well as efforts to find a way to nurture innovation in more regulated industry. So those are the kind of macro story that I put out in terms of financing and regulation.
That's great. Thank you very much. We've had a few questions on electrification, which you did talk a little bit about. This question from Rick Temchin. Can you expand on your thoughts on electrification of buildings and industrial processes and the prospects for decarbonization?
Well, again, I think that there is, we all have an aspiration, and we see that in the CLCPA in New York, We see it in the net zero commitments in the other states that we do business in, as well as in our own plans. I think the reality is that with respect to large industrial processes, I think there's still a lot of unknowns. There's still pathways that we need to be exploring. I know, Heather, you talk to large customers all the time about different kinds of pathways that companies need to explore, and they stem from business processes all the way through to energy efficiency. In large businesses, energy efficiency in property and real estate, and I think that these are all things that I think that different companies are working on, and I think we'll likely see multiple pathways for how we progress the net zero ambition that we've all set out to achieve.
Great.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think that there is incredible creativity and innovation that comes from large industrial manufacturers and large scale facilities, but electrification of some processes right now, we're not there yet. Many of these companies have taken advantage of things like demand response programs that have resulted in a lot, I think, of additional efficiency. But there's still more innovation that needs to come, let's say.
Great, thank you very much. And you did speak a little bit earlier about decentralized business models. So a question here from Paresh Patel. How do you adjust to decentralized business models like micro or mini solar grids or peer-to-peer rooftop solar trading networks? An example being the power ledger of the Brooklyn grid.
Yeah, we need to we need to find ways where we're investing in modernizing the grid, investing in technology like smart meters, investing in technology like battery storage technologies, investing in ways where we can encourage whether it's peer-to-peer energy or actually technologies like blockchain that people have been talking about in New York and elsewhere. And all of it is around how do we capture value that exists from distributed, locally introduced generation into the grid at different places at different times. How do we capture that value and how do we provide it back to customers so that we result, we get a sort of a little cyclical thing where more customers engage because there's value, which results in more entrepreneurs and more business models, developing. I think that is a goal that I think we all need to have, and that's both innovation, technology, but also, as I said before, encouraging innovation in a regulated utility construct.
I wish we had more time to get to the list of questions, but I'd encourage all of you who had questions that we couldn't get to go onto the Our Energy Policy site, where there's opportunity to engage further in online dialogue and discussion about these issues across the board. Our abundant thanks to Heather Briccetti for a great conversation, to Badar Khan and National Grid. I think your comments about being customer-centric, being transparent, focusing on innovation and collaboration, I think it resonates with all of us who understand the work that's ahead of us and require all of those things. So we're very grateful for the really thoughtful, in-depth discussion that you all conducted today. And I hope it will continue online, because that's an opportunity for all of you in the community to continue to weigh in and exchange thoughts and look for new ideas and areas of consensus to pursue. Finally, again, thanks to our partners. Thanks particularly to my co-host, Bob Catell, for joining me today. I certainly wish all of you out there the best for the holiday coming up, to stay healthy, stay well, and please, please remain engaged in what we're doing. We'll have some upcoming webinars before the end of the year, which I think will be of great interest, particularly as we head into next year. So thanks again to everybody for being part of this today, and our best wishes to be well, stay healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks, Heather.
Bill.
Thanks.